Good evening, folks. You're here listening to Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson, and this is WJOPLP Joppa Radio 96.3. And I'm glad to have y'all join me as we delve into the conversation about, well, here's one for you. Movies, shows, particularly movies that portray a life of hood life, of Black life. Some people would call that gangster life. And what does that mean as we really frame this notion of stereotypes that may be there? Merit, truth or not, who knows? And so what got me thinking about this for a little bit, and something I wanted to share, is there's a show that caught my attention, and I've seen a few episodes, and it's called Snowfall. And maybe some of you are familiar with it or not, I don't know, but it's interesting. Snowfall is a movie that's taking place in South Central LA, roughly around 1983. In 1983 is a time where it's pre-crack cocaine emerging on the streets, but yet you're starting to see some of the national, international elements coalesce into a local neighborhood, middle class, lower middle class Black neighborhood in LA that's about to be overrun by a new menace, crack cocaine. And if you don't know this story too often, Snowfall, it starts off really strong, right? Here I am, I'm pretending to be a film critic, and I'm no film critic. I'm just expressing an opinion in terms of what's taking place here and what I'm kind of noticing. But Snowfall takes place starting roughly around 1983. And I'm going to try not to spoil this at all, so I promise that's not going to happen. In this film, you got folks who are living on the street, doing their thing, right? Selling recreational drugs, things such as marijuana, for example, a little cannabis that's taking place there. And we know, of course, for a long period of time, too, that some of those early recreational drugs were used to incarcerate a number of Black and brown folks. And that's where kind of the narrative starts off. You have this young brother who attempted to go to college, but ran into financial difficulty. Brilliant brother. So he comes back to the hood, comes back to South Central LA, and he started working with his uncle, just kind of selling, weed, marijuana, all that kind of good cannabis stuff that we're seeing here. But in the process of doing this, he's going to encounter a CEI agent, right? And so now you're starting to think, this sounds a little bit like fantasy, but it isn't, because there's some hint of truth in this too. And so in this film, the CEI agent comes in contact with folks who are living in South Central LA, and they work out a deal in which they start bringing in bricks of cocaine. In the process of doing this, folks learn how to carve up that cocaine and turn it into crack rock. Really addictive, cheap stuff. In this film, there's a lot of great ironies that's there. One, I don't even know if I'd call him the protagonist, but this young brother who had to come back home from college because he could no longer afford it, his name is Franklin Saint. And I love the fact that his last name is Saint. He comes back, and part of his notion here is the fact that I want to help Black folks. I want to help my community. He always turns around and he looks at the systemic oppression, the way in which white supremacy, the ways in which capitalism has oppressed Black people in their own neighborhoods. And so he goes on to talk about how I'm going to elevate Black people into a whole nother status of being. And in his mind, right, he really believed that's what he's doing as he's looking to capitalize on making a lot of money. But in the process, he's portrayed on one hand as somewhat of a hero to people, but yet if you pay attention, he's a villain in the sense that he's responsible for the crack cocaine epidemic that's going to hit a lot of urban centers, even beyond South Central LA, as the show really does a good job depicting how they're going to expand their markets into places like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Miami, Little Rock, Arkansas, Las Vegas, Nevada, right? And so all of these things continue to transpire. Along the way, he walks and he pays attention to looking at people who are addicted to crack, watching folks who can't cope, can't do anything, hold a job because they're so addicted, looking at their debilitating health efforts that are happening. This stuff is being sold in schools in his neighborhood. And yet, in his mind, he really believes that by selling crack cocaine, he's going to bring in enough money to create development projects, more housing, more economic and employment opportunities for Black folks living into this venture. And see, that's where he's fooled. Because see, at the end of the day, Franklin Saint's only helping himself. But he's also, as the narrative of the movie goes along, comes into contact with a CEI agent. And Teddy is a CEI agent. And the whole idea, which we know to be true, is the fact that the CEI, they look to sell crack cocaine on the streets, particularly in Black neighborhoods, in order to make enough money to fund the Iran-Contra situation, right? Particularly between the Contras and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So now you have this local thing that's really driven by international politics, Cold War ideology, and all of these macro elements between the United States and their allies and the Soviet Union and their allies. And all of this seems to land in the backyards of Black folks. That is true, people. That did transpire. And we know there's a lot of writing, records, news reporting on how the US government, the CEI, put crack cocaine in the hood. But the interesting thing about this movie is it got me thinking about shows of old that really kind of romanticize hood life and what it's like to be Black and to live into particular neighborhoods. When you watch this show Snowfall, particularly for folks like me, and I'm somewhat of a nostalgic person, I found myself falling in love with the language they're using, words that were being used even when I was too young to use those languages, but I paid attention to it. Going back to the early 80s, for example, the style and the clothing. The interesting thing, of course, about Snowfall is that they're listening to old school hip hop. I mean, you're talking about Run DMC type stuff. UFTO, for example, I think that's the right name for them. Really, this old school stuff. Most of it coming out of the East Coast, because we haven't gotten into that whole East-West Coast battle over rap music at this particular time yet. LL Cool J. I think even Kool Moe Dee is slowly merging onto the scene, though I want to say that's probably more around 85, 86, if I'm thinking right on this, the centrality of this point I'm making here. So you're caught up in the fact that there's no cell phones. When someone has got to make a deal or contact their buyer, their seller, they're constantly looking at their beeper, right? It starts beep, 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 beep. It goes off, and they got to go to a pay phone or to someone's phone and call in because there were no cell phones at this time. You're captivated by the absence of cell phones, the absence of laptops, the absence of computers. This digital technological format is just invisible because that's just the age. You're looking at the cars that were being driven to. So in this show, there's a lot of nice stuff you want to hold on to because it's really good. But I'm going to go ahead and say there's a lot of violence in this show. There's a lot of stereotyping in this show, particularly the portrayal of Black people and Black identity. There are some elements where they show Black intelligence that's there. But even when they get to a point where they illustrate, when they illuminate the purpose of Black intelligence, there's a default to the way Black people operate and navigate. Now, just to be transparent here too, this show was written, put together by probably one of the greatest Black film directors of all time. African-American brother who passed away, I want to say a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, by the name of John Singleton. And if you recognize that name, John Singleton, it's probably because he put together really one of the best and the first movies of this genre that came to fruition known as Boys in the Hood. And Boys in the Hood, that's a movie I saw back when I was just entering high school about what was it like living in South Central LA. It was a movie that made Ice Cube into a Hollywood star. Remember, because gangster rap by the time Boys in the Hood came about had already emerged by 1990. I want to say that was the year of this film. And so as you watch Snowfall, as you think about some of the old school films, I would say that it is worth paying attention to them, taking notes, asking questions about what has merit, what doesn't have merit. See, when I look at Snowfall, it's almost like Scarface, Tony Montana coming into play, right? If you haven't seen Scarface, that's a legendary film, right? That's one that you want to take a look at. So it's like merging Scarface with Boys in the Hood. And by merging those two, you get Snowfall. The show Snowfall does start to change a little bit. I think for dramatic purposes, it feels a little less hood, a little less gangster, and more mobster, capitalism, wealth industry as it continues to move forward. And so it shifts away from some of the other, what we would call hood films early on, such as I already mentioned, Boys in a Hood. Menace to Society is another great one that really kind of delves into that fold, and something that I think people really want to experiment and watch just to get a sense of the nostalgic, the absence of some of the technology that we see today, but also how does it represent Black life? Making note of what do you believe to be true in actuality and what is a falsity that's there too. And there are always a lot of falsities, even among films that Black people create, particularly for cinematic effect. And of course, we understand that industries in Hollywood make the final decision on what goes through and what doesn't. And we know Hollywood also likes those stereotypes, particularly when it comes to depicting Black people in a frame of mind, the way those images have become celebrated in popular mainstream culture too. Don't know if I mentioned the show Juice, which is another one. I believe Juice is one of those early ones where Tupac Shakur really got his early fame to work. One that I like, it was by a guy, actor was in there by the name of Wesley Snipes. Again, I saw this one back, probably right before high school, maybe right as I was entering high school. And in this film, it's called The New Jack City. He becomes kind of like the kingpin, East Coast type stuff. He's living in the Bronx, for example. He's living in different predominantly communities of color where drugs run rampant. And you start to see that quite a bit. Now, those are just a few things that are there. There are probably some other films that I'm not even thinking about at this particular time. But as we think about it, one of the questions we want to hold on to is, what is true? What is myth? What is this idea of the myth of gangster tales when it comes to Black life and Black image? We see that oftentimes even in not just movies, but in music. I was talking to someone recently about country music and how one of the most ubiquitous framings in country music is the fact that everyone drinks whiskey this and whiskey that. You can't go a few verses without someone talking about, how much whiskey they had lately. Then you start to read a little bit more about some of these country music artists, and you discover they don't even drink whiskey. Not only do they not drink whiskey, they don't drink alcohol in general because it's become a pattern of what's expected of that genre, of that culture, right? Country music, big pickup trucks, guns in the back of the big pickup trucks to go deer hunting in the morning on weekends, for example. There's always something about Jesus, God, and church in country music, right? Stayed out too late on Friday and Saturday night drinking whiskey, got up early on Saturday to go have a little bit more whiskey and to go deer hunting just to end up in the pews of church on Sunday morning. All of those things are there. That exists too when we talk about Black music, particularly hip hop and gangster music. And some of that in gangster music is even a falsity too. You got folks talking about what it's like living in a hood and how about the violence of life, and life is violent and the struggles navigating through space. Worried about someone rolling up on you from behind. You got to watch your back. You got to live a dangerous life, particularly in your gangs and the way these things operate. And they're talking about all kind of stuff there. Then you come to find out that some of these folks singing this gangster music grew up in a very stable, middle class, if not upper middle class home, where they went to a predominantly white private school. Now retired football player, Michael Irvin. He's a Hall of Fame football player. He played for the Dallas Cowboys for a long time. He went to college at the University of Miami. He grew up living in that hood life. And one of the things about Michael Irvin, of course, is that he became a celebrity, made a lot of money. But one of the news controversies that's popped up recently is the fact that Michael Irvin's son has released some videos and some songs and talking about what is it like to be a gangster? What is it like to live in a hood? You see him walking around in his big kitchen now, holding what looks like some kind of assault rifle and throwing money up, making it rain in that kind of way, right? Talking about the danger of life in a hood and how challenging it is. So his dad, Michael Irvin, came out and said, I have no idea what my son's talking about. My son grew up in a home that's probably, 15,000 square feet in a gated community, private school education, luxury vacations, had everything he ever wanted. And Michael Irvin criticized his son, particularly for the fact that he said, I grew up in a hood. I lived that life. I went off to college. I played ball in the NFL. I'm now he's an announcer, a sports announcer, and I'm doing all of this stuff because I don't want your life to be like the life that I wanted. And one of the things that's happened, of course, is you find that folks become romanticized by hood movies. And this is true for Black folks, not just Black people, but they become romanticized by hood movies such as Snowfall, Menace to Society, Juice, right? And they like that. They become romanticized by the videos that they see and living this tough life, right? There's a level of masculinity. We won't get into that on this episode, but there's a level of masculinity that encapsulates Black male souls who fantasize about wanting to be the boss, wanting to live that hood life, wanting to be a gangster, wanting to have some type of status and substance in a way where they can pontificate the centrality of whatever message they're trying to get across. And yet Michael Irvin is sitting there and saying, I don't think so. Folks, as you're thinking about this, I just wanted kind of to challenge you with something that's a different narrative, particularly when it delves into pop culture. And I'm not always the best person when it comes to pop culture, but things that you may have seen. So you ever get a chance, fire me an email, send me a note. Let me know if you've seen any of these films that I've mentioned. Do you find yourself being pulled in by this type of genre stuff? It's addictive, much like probably gangster music is, gangster rap. I'll tell you, I don't listen to a whole lot of gangster rap. I listen to the music of my parents, Teddy Pendergrass, Luther Vandross, for example, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Aretha Franklin, right? I can go on and on and on and on and on. And those are the things that kind of work for this soul brother in a lot of ways. Thank you, folks, for chiming in to Race Matters. I hope that you're having a good evening. Hope you'll continue to chime in more and more and more as we delve into different narratives, as we really focus on race matters, the topic of race. Take care. Be well. I'm out of here.